Hey everybody, Becky here, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. Today I'm just going to do a short quick video to show you how to sew a French seam. So a French seam is just basically another way to sew a seam and finish a seam. A French seam is where you sew your pieces together with wrong sides together, then you flip it out with right sides together, and then sew your seam again so that your seam is enclosed. So this is a pair of pants that I am working on, and this is the inside of my garment. So you can see here, this is my French seam, and there's no exposed edges, and then on the outside it looks just normal. So a French seam is great for a couple different reasons. If you are sewing with wovens, it's a way to finish your edge, especially if you don't have a serger. It is a really great way to do that. It looks really great and professional. It can get kind of tricky if your pattern isn't written for it. If there's pockets and slits and things like that, there are ways to do it. You just have to look into it a little bit more, but you can pretty much complete anything with a French seam. And another thing that's great about French seam is because you are sewing your seam twice, you have two stitch lines in your seam. It adds strength to your fabric, which is great for lightweight fabrics, fabrics that tend to pull, like a gauze, chiffon, or things like that. You don't want serged edges, or like I mentioned, you don't have a serger. So a French seam is very simple to do, a basic one when on just a straight one. So I'm going to just show you real quick how we do that. So let's get started. All right, so a couple things with a French seam. You're going to want an iron. So I have my ironing board out here, and you're going to want to make sure you can tell your wrong side from right side. This is a solid, and a lot of times with wovens, they are yarn dyed, meaning the right side and the wrong side is the same. So just like this pair of shorts that I showed you, there's technically really not a wrong side or a right side, which can make doing French seams, honestly, that's sometimes the hardest part for me, is telling the wrong side from right side. So as you can see here, what I like to do is on all of my pieces, I put a sticker on the wrong side. This is just a label that I ripped up. So all of my pieces, or you could do it, you could do it on the right side, however you want to mark it. And that's actually great even if you aren't doing French seams. But the thing with French seams is you sew it, then you trim it, and then you sew it again. So the issue arises when you trim that seam and then you have to go back and fix it, and it gets really hard to fix it. So there's less room for a French seam. So what we're gonna do is I'm going to show you how to do it. It's the same thing if you're doing a straight seam, but I'm going to show you just on the curve just so you can see that is possible. You're going to just lay out your pattern pieces, and I'm going to lay this one out with the wrong side facing up. This white dot indicates my wrong side. Then I'm going to take my other pant leg with the wrong side facing down. There's my white dot, and line up this crotch seam here, and then we're just going to pin. And your seam allowance is gonna differ depending on what you're doing. Typically it's like a 1/2 inch, which is what this is. So for this pattern, your first seam, I sew a 1/4 inch, and then I sew another 1/4 inch. Sometimes it's sometimes you sew like a 1/4 inch and then 3/8 inch. It just kind of varies, but these steps are all the same. Just you gotta kind of watch your seam allowances, just like with anything. So you're just gonna sew down this seam, and like I said, I'm gonna do this using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And with that, if you are using a pattern that doesn't have a big enough seam allowance, so you really do need at least 1/2 inch seam allowance, I would say, to be able to do a French seam. And if you wanted to do a French seam on a pattern that had a smaller seam allowance, you would just need to add that seam allowance in when you cut out your pattern to do that size, and then just take in your calculation so that once your final seam is sewn, that total seam allowance is taken out and your finished garment measurements are the same as they would be if you weren't doing the French seam. So as I said, I'm just going to go sew along this using a straight stitch at 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to be right back. All right, so once you have that sewn, you can see that there, and now we're going to trim our seam allowance. So on your curve, you just want to trim it a little bit closer to your stitch line without cutting through. And I prefer to use my pinking shears, especially on this curve, because I can get kind of close with that, and it's kind of like it notches it out. And it also just helps with fraying. You can use regular straight scissors if needed, but you're just going to trim this down at least half the length. So again, the trimming is a little bit more important for the curve, but you are going to need to trim even if you were doing a straight side, because we are going to flip this over and sew it again. So now I have that trimmed. I'm going to flip this open, and I like to just press my seam open, and on the curve it can be a little bit hard, but just to make sure that it's flipped open and even and nice and flat. And then we just flip back out, and now that seam line is right here on this fold, and then we press again so that that seam line is laying nice and flat in there. And press all the way down. And now we are just going to go right back over here, and again using another 1/4 inch seam allowance, sew down this curve to finish our front seam. So I'm going to go do that and be right back. All right, so once you sew that seam there, you are done and you have completed your first French seam. And one thing I do want to mention with that is when you look here, you can see you don't see any of that raw edge, and that is because it is all enclosed in this seam here now. And that is, like I said, one of the benefits of a French seam. It encloses your raw edges, which gives you this really nice professional finish. And if you don't trim your seams enough, then you will sew over it and you will see some of those raw edges sticking through. And a lot of times you can just go in and, like, see right here, there's a little rogue piece that was probably just a raw edge, and you can just pull it off. Or sometimes you have to go in with like scissors, and if it's really bad, you will have to pull that seam out and trim it down. But as long as you trim your first seam allowance down to less than the seam allowance that you're going to be sewing at, you should be okay. You may catch a couple little like frillies where it frayed, but like I said, those you can just kind of pull out or snip off pretty easily, so those aren't too big to worry about. But this is just for a basic French seam. I did this. These are my Dahlia pants that I am releasing here soon, and they are completed all with all French seams, and they do have an inseam pocket and a slit. So I'm doing a video of the full length with the slit. If you're interested in seeing how to do a French seam with a slit, you can find that video. I'll link it down below once I release it, and you can check that out. I also have a separate video as well that I'm doing of how to do an inseam pocket with a French seam so that you can keep all of your raw edges enclosed in that French seam. But I hope you found this video helpful, and if you did, make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I will link this pattern down below as well if you wanted to check it out. And you can find me on Instagram. It's @sewbex. It's SEWBEXX, and you can reach out to me there. You can drop any questions you have in the comments down below. Thanks for watching. Bye.